is brought to you by CuriosityStream. Get access to CuriosityStream and my streaming service Nebula, and watch my Nebula exclusive video Debater Theater by going to curiositystream.com/SarahZ and using my coupon code SarahZ at checkout. If you were on the internet from about 2011 to maybe 2015 and had even a passing interest in something like Doctor Who or the Avengers, you were probably subject to the cultural titan that was a now booming geek culture. Whether it was the nigh unstoppable plague of brown-haired dudes in their early 20s wearing green Triforce t-shirts and cargo shorts, or all your less likable friends demanding you watch Rick and Morty, or how suddenly you were practically a cultural outcast if you'd never seen an episode of Game of Thrones, the idea of geek as an identity was suddenly everywhere, and it was inescapable. Memes, fan art, discussion threads, and cosplay were bigger than ever before. People were openly identifying as nerdy without even a little bit of shame or derision attached to the label, and the people who, it seems like for years, were treated as little more than a pathetic punchline were starting to run the world. It was a very specific era in terms of its cultural products, the websites used, the ways in which people talked, and the things people believed. An era that seems to be over now, even as geek media like Marvel is only growing more ubiquitous. This was the Walking Dead era, the Game of Thrones era, the Superwholock era, the era of Loot Crate and ThinkGeek and Scott Pilgrim and Felicia Day worship and Joss Whedon being seen as the king of it all. And with that era now past us, it might be worth taking a deeper look into what was up with all that. How did we get here? What was it like in its peak? Why are things kind of different now? And also, what can we learn from taking a more critical look at its past? So let's give this culture not the retrospective it needs, but the retrospective it deserves. So this video is primarily going to focus in on a very particular point in time with regards to geek culture, more specifically the late aughts to mid-2010s geek boom that we saw across sites like Tumblr and Reddit and Cheeseburger, and the growing cultural ubiquity of geek property. I can't cover the entire history of the geek in a single video, nor do I really want to, but in order to set the stage for how we got here, I do think it's worth very briefly exploring what this culture was like prior to that period, because the ways in which self-identified geeks perceive themselves and many aspects that shaped the subculture have their roots in the geek communities of the 1980s and earlier.
I don't have to take this. I'm going home.
Terms like geek and nerd were being used as self-identification labels at least as far back as the late 80s, but they were also very commonly pejoratives, primarily to refer to very bookish, socially awkward guys who were really into computers and tabletop games and comic books.
People judge you differently than they did in high school.
The word actually has its origins in describing sideshow carnival performers, and this association persisted for a long time. Geek characters in popular media throughout the 80s and 90s commonly existed to be the butt of the joke. People like Steve Urkel or Screech on Saved by the Bell, or Skippy on Family Ties, or even Milhouse on The Simpsons. Films like Revenge of the Nerds 1984 served to play on the comedy of the long-standing stereotype that people who are really into things like computers were bullied, socially inept, and couldn't get girls.
Nerds! 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 Come on, Lewis, let's go.
Although we very soon would start to see a shift in the popularity of pretty much everything that had come to define geekdom, and the term geek would take on a much more positive connotation, the association of geekdom with persecution would persist nonetheless. One massive factor in the perceived persecution of geek communities is the satanic panic of the 1980s and 1990s. This was over an entire decade where, based on a now discredited and ridiculously over-the-top memoir about a girl who was subject to ritual satanic abuse growing up, though that story is for another time, we started to see this culture of fear-mongering surrounding Satanists. Never mind that Christian institutions are one of the biggest historical and ongoing perpetrators of child abuse in North America, of course. Instead, there were constant books and news reports and even incarcerations based around the falsified notion that satanic ritual abuse was happening in institutions like daycares, and that kids and teenagers were essentially being groomed into Satanism in a variety of ways. One subculture that was particularly affected by this was the TTRPG community, which at the time was a lot of tactical war games and, of course, Dungeons and Dragons. This was largely spurred on by the fact that a university student had gone missing in 1979 and was being searched for by his parents, and who later went on to take his own life. Although he had multiple pre-existing issues with depression, the private investigator hired to find him believed that his disappearance was somehow tied to the fact that he played D&D, that he had been lured into some kind of satanic cult. In the 1980s, then, there was a huge push to ban D&D in all kinds of settings based on the belief that D&D was satanic or occult. In the words of Pastor John Quigley,
"The game is an occult tool that opens up young people to influence or possession by demons."
D&D was removed from bookstores, parents would ban it from their houses and call for its banning in schools, and you'd see a rise in largely Christian media demonizing the game, no pun intended. Including Dark Dungeons, which was a chick tract about a girl who gets sucked into a cult of actual witches and demon worshippers by getting into D&D, and has some of the most incredible writing I've ever seen.
The thief, Blackleaf, did not find the poison trap, and I declare her dead.
No, not Blackleaf! No, I'm going to die! Don't make me quit the game, please don't! Somebody save me! You can't do this!
Marcy, get out of here. You're dead. You don't exist anymore.
Which spell did you cast, Debbie?
I used the mind bondage spell on my father. He was trying to stop me from playing D&D.
I mean, that is what happens when a player character dies in this game. It's happened to me, it's never fun. The religious opposition to nerdy interests would decline a little bit throughout the 1990s, but it wouldn't die out entirely. You'd actually see a similar backlash to the release of the Harry Potter novels, and a banning of them under the same perception that they promoted Satanism and witchcraft, that is not what's bad about them. As a result of the honestly many decades throughout which geek persecution was a very real and wide-scale thing, this narrative of the geek as the underdog has always followed this subculture, and has even kind of been passed on generationally to younger geeks, who didn't necessarily have those same experiences, but still claim them as an inherent part of what being a geek is nonetheless. This is going to have some interesting ramifications later, and it's a mindset I want you to keep in mind throughout the video as the things that define geekdom become more and more ubiquitous. But the 90s really did represent a shift of the label from overwhelmingly negative to kind of going either way. With the founding of Best Buy's Geek Squad in 1994, shows like Freaks and Geeks 1999, or the rise of Bill Gates as a cultural figure, often lovingly described as a geek, throughout the decade you started to see a lot more positivity around the label, even as geeky remained a term of derision. A lot of self-identified geeks started to use online chat rooms to connect with other like-minded people, bound together by a love of things like Star Trek, comic books, and computers. In terms of people self-identifying as geeks online, you'd actually start to see online content as far back as 1993's Geek Code, basically a line of code you'd put in your online signature to denote that you were a geek. Or in 2003, this website InnerGeek put out this never have I ever style geek test marketed towards self-identified geeks with items like, have you ever programmed code on a calculator? Or have you ever solved a Rubik's Cube, where the more boxes you clicked, the nerdier you were. Before it was put online, it was actually a Word document people would email around to each other back in 1999. It's a very interesting look into what people considered a part of geek culture at the time. Computer stuff, going to conventions, playing tabletop role-playing games, and being academically adept and socially inept. It's still up, actually. I took it and I got 30.07%, or total geek. This video essay's cool, but I wish there was a way to find the geeks and gamers in the crowd. Anyway, geek culture in the 90s and early 2000s really started to take shape. I could talk at more length about what the scene was like at the time and what the biggest interests were and where people congregated, but this video is long enough already, and that's an entire other video topic, so suffice it to say, we started to see a real culture form. It had some early brushes with mainstreaming, so things like geek chic fashion becoming popular in the 2000s, for instance, but it was nevertheless definitely a form of counterculture. But around the late 2000s, things started shifting. Over the course of about 5 years, there was this massive mainstreaming of the geek identity, born of a variety of factors we'll talk about in a second. This this previously kinda derogatory, kinda reclaimed counterculture started to grow until geek products became more and more popular and the identity became a bigger and bigger marketing niche until eventually we hit critical mass. And previously hailed as uniquely geeky interests were just interests. So what gives? A lot of things, but one of them is sure to elicit groans all around. Okay, so in 2007, this show called The Big Bang Theory began airing on CBS.
I'm a hobbit. A hobbit. Are misfiring neurons in your hippocampus preventing the conversion from short-term to long-term memory?
It's a basic sitcom with a relatively basic sitcom premise. Four nerds struggle with relationship issues, particularly after an attractive woman named Penny moves next to them. Like Friends if everyone was Ross. You can decide if I meant that as a compliment or not. While initially not a big hit, the show quickly grew in popularity thanks to syndication and word of mouth to the point where it became the biggest sitcom on television. It became a juggernaut in its own right, and love it or hate it, it's important to geek culture and popular culture as a whole. Plus, it gave us Young Sheldon, the prequel spin-off show that's actually a murder mystery about Sheldon solving a new case every week, and you can't prove me wrong on that because nobody has actually watched Young Sheldon. Reception to the series in geek circles has been mixed. The series does have a lot of fans who are self-described nerds or geeks or scholars. One of the things about the show is they do have scientists and other experts serving as consultants to generally make sure that any reference to geek properties or complicated STEM subjects is accurate. Plus, it has an honestly really good theme song from Canada's They Might Be Giants, the Barenaked Ladies. There are gags and Easter eggs for people who care about those sorts of things, and if you go into the show looking for nothing but a standard sitcom with some nerdy references, then you'll probably be pretty satisfied watching it. But in its detractors' eyes, Big Bang Theory is a shallow show that only contributes to the stigmatization of nerds and nerd culture, and that's not necessarily wrong. The show does play very hard into that stereotype of nerds as socially inept losers, especially early on, where the joke is simply that they don't understand how to interact with women or how to function in day-to-day life. The show will have geeky jokes and references, but they're usually just flavor text placed on top of standard lazy sitcom lines. We're talking things like, I can't talk to a girl, that's more complicated than trying to track down all of Kelly Puckett's original Batgirl comic run. Like, it might be amusing if you understand the reference, but that doesn't necessarily help the feeling that it's just plugging random trivia into stale plot lines and calling it comedy.
So it's settled. The fate of Doctor Who's TARDIS will be decided by a Game of Thrones-inspired deathmatch on the battlefield of Thundercats versus Transformers.
There are a lot of videos online nowadays that are just clips from The Big Bang Theory with the laugh track taken out, and without being artificially told to laugh, it becomes incredibly clear how many of the jokes on the show are just saying the names of nerdy things and expecting them to get a laugh.
Batman. Batman and Robin. Wonder Twins plus the monkey. Wonder Twins plus the monkey and Batman.
The kind of lazy, unfunny nerd shit meant there was a lot of backlash against the show, and there was even this whole thing in the early 2010s where a lot of people called it nerd blackface, which is just fucking stupid. Like, even if you don't like the show, that's fucking stupid, especially because the show itself does have actual racism problems. Regardless of The Big Bang Theory not being a good show, it's inarguable that it was a huge proponent in the normalization of nerd and geek properties. Here was the most popular show on network TV, and it was full of nerd in-jokes and references, and with geeky characters who were allowed to be at the center of their stories rather than playing comic relief side characters. It basically took a lot of the humor that had been popular in online geek communities, jokes about video games and Will Wheaton, and placed it into a mainstream context. And whether that delighted or upset you, it was certainly a thing. Big Bang Theory wasn't the only geek thing growing in mainstream popularity, though. The early 2010s saw the rise of a number of geek-related properties getting recognition and fan bases. For example, the revival of Doctor Who became massively popular, especially after David Tennant was cast, and we saw a huge revival of Doctor Who fans in the late 2000s. Manga and anime were becoming increasingly popular throughout the early 2000s and were becoming even more accessible as a result of the massive boost in online users, and so you also saw a huge surge in the number of anime fans. Around this time, we also saw the beginnings of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, which honestly really did change things forever. Superhero films had been around for a while, especially in the 2000s right after the release of Spider-Man, but there's definitely a difference between that and what the MCU ended up being. It all kickstarted with Iron Man, which became an unexpected smash hit. No one really predicted the movie to do as well as it did, either financially or critically. It was a film based on a then relatively obscure character starring an actor who hadn't been popular for years that was also the first production of the ambitious Marvel Studios plan. And yet there was something about that first film that captured people, be it the strength of Robert Downey Jr.'s performance, or the fun, not too serious tone, or just that it's a good movie. It showed the world that you can make people care about characters they might not know about and created immediate interest in this cinematic universe plan. Not only that, but it led to Disney acquiring Marvel in 2009, bringing with them more money and resources and sending us further and further into our inevitable future where the only corporations left in the world will be Disney and Google. People aren't even going to be assigned male and female at birth anymore. You'll just be assigned Disney or Google. In a world where every teenager belongs to one of two megacorporations, one teenage girl will defy the system and rise above it all when it's revealed she's Apple. The MCU continued under the ownership of Disney, and the other entries of that first period were popular, sure. They all got generally good reviews and all did fine at the box office. But when you talk about the MCU, you definitely have to divide it up into pre-Avengers and post-Avengers.
Big man in a suit of armor. Take that away, what are you?
Genius, billionaire, playboy, philanthropist.
It can seem a bit trite now that there's been a million of these fucking things. I mean, we've gone from comic books being seen as niche or childish material to being a significant part of modern culture. Now we're at the point where every few months, Marvel threatens us by saying something like, now you all have to know who Pip the Troll is, and we all live with it and accept the fate spun for us by Kevin Feige. But that first Avengers movie was a legitimate event at the time, being treated like a huge milestone in franchise world building, blockbuster films, and it smashed financial records. It also basically ignited the MCU fanbase into how we know it today. Suddenly, you were not only not considered an insufferable nerd for knowing what Captain America's shield was made of, you were actually considered weird if you didn't know it. Hundreds of millions of people were watching this stuff and getting excited about it, and it was only going to get bigger and more culturally omnipresent in the years to come. We weren't just seeing a mainstreaming of the sci-fi branch of geekdom, of course, but of the fantasy niche as well. For years, George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series were acclaimed fantasy books that sold well, but weren't talked about that much outside of the fantasy crowd. However, once the books were adapted into the series Game of Thrones in 2011, it became an incredible hit, becoming the television show of the 2010s up until its conclusion in 2019 that basically wiped it off the face of the earth.
You know nothing, Jon Snow.
Game of Thrones wasn't the first fantasy TV series, God no, nor was it the first popular fantasy media to be adapted to the screen. The Lord of the Rings films came out a decade prior, after all. But unlike Lord of the Rings, which could still at least mask itself as being a general blockbuster affair, Game of Thrones was complicated, featuring a lot of characters, a lot of lore, an emphasis on fictional languages and cultures and geography, and a lot of explicit content and taboo subject matter that would usually be considered off-putting to a wide audience, and yet people ate it up. And in retrospect, now that we're 3 years out from the Game of Thrones experiment, that's sort of buck wild, right? That for a decade, everyone in the world got really into watching a show about fantasy land disputes and speculating about draconic heritages and getting really into fictional history. This shift into more geek-based media is seen even in the things that became cult favorites. The early 2010s also gave us things like Community, a show theoretically about a study group in community college, but really ended up being a vehicle to make fun of whatever media thing was annoying Dan Harmon at that particular moment.
Glee, it's a feeling you get when you're brain finally lets your heart get in its pants. Glee!
Community was often seen as the anti-Big Bang Theory, being a more obscure show that didn't just use geek references as flavor, but rather incorporated them more into the plot and energy of the show. A lot of Community relies on the viewer having an understanding of television tropes, nerd culture, and obscure 80s and 90s media, and an appreciation for plots that would blend the line between fiction and reality. I guess you could say that to understand Community, you had to have a high IQ. There was also another big cult hit around this time, an underrated Kino gem called Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and the comic it's based on. Scott Pilgrim tells the tale of a Canadian dating an American, an unrealistic idea, but whatever, who then has to fight 7 evil exes in order to continue dating her. What made the series stand out was its heavy use of video game references and imagery, which quickly found an audience of nerds willing to lose their mind over jokes like playing the Zelda theme or having the enemies turn into coins when they die. Scott Pilgrim's fanbase is kind of weird in that the work itself, especially the comic, is a character study meant to showcase how flawed a character like Scott is, with the video game references and presentation meant to show the immature, simplified way in which he views the world while also showing how an objectified view of women is unhealthy and affects them. However, there were a lot of people who latched onto the movie and the franchise as a whole uncritically, simply enjoying it for the nerd jokes they recognize and bugging any girl with dyed hair for the next few years to be their personal Ramona Flowers. And so essentially, we started to see the rise of what would be considered a lot of foundational nerd properties, and another reason a lot of these seemingly separate interests were consolidated under one specific and general geek label was that as the early 2010s progressed, social media platforms were becoming more and more centralized. I've talked about this at length before. That's not to say centralized platforms didn't exist at all in the 90s and aughts, but this was when we were reaching record highs of users on platforms like Twitter, Tumblr, and Reddit, and where we were seeing less and less participation in historically less centralized fan spaces like forums. There still existed spaces to geek out about generalized geek stuff prior to those years, but before then, a pretty decent amount of geek interest fan stuff was kind of sequestered off into individual spaces. If you wanted to talk Harry Potter, you would most likely do so on a Harry Potter themed live journal page or forum. If you wanted to talk about Buffy or Doctor Who, you would go on a Buffy or Doctor Who fan site in order to do that. Now though, it was becoming much more common that a lot of people's interests were starting to become consolidated into individual spaces, meaning you could much more easily engage with multiple fandoms at once and construct a broader identity around being involved with multiple of them. This, of course, manifested in several ways. One of those ways was the increasing popularity of platforms like Memebase. If you check out Memebase now, it's just a very clearly dying website made up of stolen Twitter screenshots, but if you're anything like me, you'll remember how back in 2012, there were tons of different Memebase pages based around nearly every geek fandom imaginable. Memebase was the central website behind I Can Has Cheeseburger, a site that was especially popular in the late aughts for those impact font memes of cats who can't spell, which honestly was the best use of the internet, and I think we should exclusively use the information superhighway for that from now on. But at that time, Cheeseburger was getting millions of views per day and started to form meme-based offshoots called the Cheeseburger Network. So you'd see offshoots like My Little Brony, this huge community of My Little Pony memes, or Poke memes, or Doctor Who all-time Lord all the time. A lot of it was and continues to be stolen fan comics from DeviantArt, but it was also stolen art, stolen cosplays, impact memes, and just generally a lot more geeky interest stuff in one centralized place. There was even an option to group all of the geek-style meme-based pages into one and view them together, so you would see stuff like Doctor Who and Game of Thrones and Portal all in one area, lumped into being geek stuff. There was this perception that all of these differing interests were in some way linked together on the basis of this fan identity. At least as far as I'm aware, meme-based generally overlapped pretty significantly with male geek culture in particular, and more broadly the Reddit crowd, another website that was rapidly becoming more popular than ever before, with fandom memes abound and a general lack of central moderation as an advertising point. Once again, because you could customize your own front page, all of your geek interests could be consolidated into one place and one label much more easily than they could when they were sequestered off into their own niche forums. It made being a geek a lot easier. You didn't need to go to in-person conventions to have all of your nerdy interests in one place. And in very few places was this more obvious than on Tumblr, a website which at the time was fucking huge. At that time, Tumblr was near its peak, reaching 100 million daily posts by 2014. Incidentally, this number has shrunk to about 20% of that today. Because, like those other centralized platforms, you could do all your nerd stuff in one place, Tumblr's very specific flavor of geek culture could really thrive. You weren't just a Doctor Who fan, or a Portal fan, or a Dan and Phil fan. If you were a fan of Sherlock, you were probably a fan of the Hobbit movies, and if you were a fan of the Hobbit movies, you were probably a fan of Welcome to Night Vale, and if you were a fan of Welcome to Night Vale, you were probably a fan of Supernatural, and if you were a fan of Supernatural, you were probably a fan of Doctor Who, etc., etc., etc. Because you could follow other users really easily and absorb their interests by osmosis, this part of Tumblr often moved very quickly and together into new popular geeky interests, to the extent that being a fandom person wasn't really about being into one thing so much as about being into everything. And this is where we saw the birth of Superwholock. Okay, so if you're not familiar, Superwholock was kind of two things, a sort of mix between an alternate universe and a fandom. There was first Superwholock as the alternate universe. So basically, this was a hypothetical crossover between Sherlock, Doctor Who, and Supernatural. Obviously, this would never actually happen on TV for a broad range of reasons, but fans didn't really expect it to. You'd see tons of edited GIF sets where people would make fake fan-written GIFs of this hypothetical crossover show, or fan fiction of Matt Smith and Basket Weave Cameltoe interacting, or fan art of Dean Winchester getting his back blown out by Rory, probably. But it was also just this catch-all term for being a fan of the three shows independently. The three Superwholock shows were often conflated, and if you were a fan of one, it was assumed you were a fan of all three, which is kind of interesting because they don't all actually have that much in common, but nonetheless, being a Superwholock fan was often less about actually interacting with all three forms of media closely, but more so just a statement about the kind of person you were. So it wouldn't be uncommon to, for example, own Redbubble merch of Castiel vibing on top of the TARDIS, or have a Tumblr URL that combined as many fandoms as possible in your name as if you were collecting them like Pokemon. So many URLs like Dean and John Watson in Loki's TARDIS, or Castiel's companion in 221B with the Master and that one guy who played Peter Pan at Disney World. It was an era where adopting a very specific and very broad-reaching range of fandom interests was really the norm, and it was easier than ever before. And by God, when this geek culture exploded, it exploded. I think if I had to name a year where that explosion was the most significant, I'd have to pick 2012. The release of The Avengers in particular was a huge boon for bringing people into the geek community. You had people finally start to get invested in comics, for example, and because of how broad and all-encompassing these newer social networks were, if you were into comics, you might make friends who are into comics, and if your friends are into comics, they're probably into TTRPGs, etc., etc., etc. Not to mention Joss Whedon, who we will talk more about later, don't you worry, having directed the movie meant a lot of people started to check out his other work. So you had this new influx of people getting into Buffy and Firefly and Dr. Horrible, and I was gonna say Dollhouse, but nobody got into Dollhouse and nobody should. If you want a numerical way to look at this rise, you can see it just by looking at attendance numbers for the biggest comic conventions in the States. 2008 was the first turning point for a lot of these conventions, especially the big one, San Diego Comic-Con. It had started out as some small gatherings in the 70s, and by the end of the aughts, it was an institution pulling names like Bill Hader, Seth Rogen, and Sigourney Weaver. It was the first year they sold out, and by the year after, tickets were selling out up to a year in advance and being scalped near immediately. By 2010, they were selling out in a matter of literal hours to a maximum of about 130,000 tickets, and by 2012, other previously smaller conventions like New York's had caught up to those numbers. We started to see New York City Comic-Con going from 116,000 attendance to 133,000. Seattle's Emerald City Comic-Con was still in a 5-figure attendance just by pure numbers, but attendance jumped up 65% between 2011 and 2012, and up another 20% in 2013. Or, okay, this is where my personal experience comes in, but Calgary, where I'm from, saw a huge increase in attendance for their 2012 con.
I got this jade hat.
and
Yes, I'm a moron t-shirt.
I'm not a moron, my weekly shirt. I won a bunch of rage pins. I have more, but I'm not gonna wear them all. Barcode tattoo. It's pretty cool. Do you think we missed Adam Baldwin?
The closest estimates I can find online, albeit nothing specific, suggest somewhere from 10 to 20,000 people came in 2010 and 2011, and then in 2012, okay, they had estimated that about 45,000 people were going to come, and then they hit that number by the end of the morning. And they still had thousands of people with tickets just waiting outside, waiting to be let in, but they had literally hit the fire code capacity for the entire venue. I was there, and I remember just being amazed at how huge it was because I considered myself a geek and I spent a lot of time on geeky websites, but I only had like one friend in person who shared my interests, and so seeing this huge display of people who were like me selling pins and merch and branded t-shirts and playing Settlers of Catan and D&D out in the open and listening to Adam Baldwin talk about Firefly because we still liked Adam Baldwin at the time, and so I loaded up on every single piece of merch I could afford, and then my friend and I went outside because, you know, like we'd been waiting in these shockingly massive lines for hours upon hours, and we had a panel of all the Star Trek The Next Generation actors coming up, and it was the 25-year anniversary, and it was this really big deal, and so we wanted some sunlight first, and so we went outside and got some sun, and they did not let us back in. Like, we tried to go in, and they told us we were not allowed back in the venue, so we had to stand in a line, and every 15 minutes they let 100 people in until finally we got back to the convention hall. I remember we were in line next to this couple, and they told us they were from the States and they had traveled all the way to Calgary and stayed in hotels and spent all this money just so they could come to our convention and see the Next Generation cast do their panel, and now they were worried they weren't going to be allowed into the convention at all. It was a complete chaotic mess, and it was very clear that absolutely none of the con organizers were expecting such a massive jump in attendance, and it was amazing.
The nerdgasm.
This is amazing! With stuff like Felicia Day's web series about being a gamer, The Guild, shows like Community and The Big Bang Theory, and the start of the MCU, we were seeing geek stuff on the rise in general, but 2012 feels like the year it went from increasingly large and popular subculture to bordering on just regular culture. 2012 was also the year we saw the launch of Geek and Sundry, which was basically this production company started by Felicia Day, who was seeing a huge surge in her popularity as a result of stuff like The Guild, Dr. Horrible, and Dragon Age Redemption.
You can't grow if you're still immersed in an imaginary social environment.
It's not imaginary, I told you.
Can't get them off you.
Wait,
fuck.
I'm dying. I need heals. Heal me.
Incoming. I play with real people.
She was, for a long time, and in some parts of the internet still is, kind of seen as the icon for female geeks, and was treated as both beloved and, in some cases, as a sex symbol for female geekdom. Keep in mind, this was the era of geek is the new sexy, where you'd see a lot more cosplay pin-up photo shoots and things like that. But more on that later. Geek and Sundry started out by producing a couple small-time web series and continued producing The Guild, but really struck gold in 2015 with Critical Role, this now insanely famous web series featuring a number of professional actors playing D&D in this broad, spanning, emotional narrative. For a while, the Geek and Sundry company was one of the most prominent voices in online nerd culture, headed by one of its most prominent icons, and its golden age really represents the height of that specific era in geek culture. It's an era with a really defined aesthetic, filled with a lot of now defunct stuff that really dates it to that 2008, 2016-ish period. On top of stuff like Geek and Sundry, for example, this is when the website ThinkGeek was around. Honestly, we need a union for people who lost so much of their time and money on ThinkGeek. The site started in 1999, but got big in the early 2010s. You could buy tons of Fandom branded merch like the portal gun, or a sleeping bag that looks like the Tauntauns from Star Wars, and lots of little gadgets that I still think of as genuinely cool, like little robots that move around while you play video games, or an LED hoodie that lights up and syncs to music to make it look like you're casting spells, and some neat science products like aerogel. ThinkGeek would later get acquired by GameStop and become bad and eventually shut down in 2019, so when you're thinking of the site's golden age, you're probably thinking about that early 2010s era. They did this thing where every April Fool's they'd come out with a bunch of fake gadgets, and then in the following days they'd make the popular ones for real. Similarly, you'd also start to see other big retailers really begin to capitalize on fandom merch. Specifically, you can see a real shift happen with the store Hot Topic. Throughout the 2000s, Hot Topic had a very specific reputation, such that its inclusion in literary classic My Immortal makes it very accessible shorthand for being gothic. It was the store of emo kids and mall goths, where you'd go if you were the kind of kid with dyed black hair and heavy eyeliner and went by Raven or Midnight or Vampire. It was kind of mocked by real goths as being for posers. South Park even launched it into international fame by making fun of it on that basis, but it nevertheless had the reputation of being a gothic store for teens who wore all black above all else. But throughout the late aughts, and especially throughout the beginning of the 2010s, you'd start to see Hot Topic take on more and more brand deals, including with giant companies like Disney. The graphic tee section started to feature more and more logos. Most of the fashion items were now associated with some kind of vaguely fandom-related IP, and while you can still find a few vaguely gothy items now, it's now considered much more of a nerd/brand shop than a goth shop, and you can really trace the artistic bimbofication of Hot Topic to that same era in geek culture. Also, fun fact that really exemplifies this shift, Hot Topic attempted to buy ThinkGeek back in 2015, but was outbidded by GameStop. God, I want it back. Give me goth Hot Topic or give me death. Another big staple of that era was an increased wave of adults, especially but not exclusively men, getting into animation. In particular, both My Little Pony Friendship is Magic and Rick and Morty come immediately to mind. The brony fandom exploded around this time as well, often drawing mixed responses from people outside the community. Meanwhile, we saw Rick and Morty, a comedy show about a little guy and his detached super genius grandpa, absolutely explode in terms of its viewership and popularity. Rick and Morty in particular drew the attention of the geek crowd for a number of reasons. It was created by Dan Harmon, the guy who did Harmontown and obviously cult favorite Community. There was a lot of emphasis on sort of science humor, and a lot of people really liked Rick Sanchez, sometimes in ways that were explicitly counter to the intended message of the show.
The only connection between your unquestionable intelligence and the sickness destroying your family is that everyone in your family, you included, use intelligence to justify sickness.
Keep in mind that this was an era where you saw a pretty big rise in a specific type of character. Basically, a contrarian super genius man who was kind of an asshole and was really good at arguing, but generally had their heart in the right place, and similarly, there was kind of an era of hero worship of that sort of character. I'm talking people like Baby Doll Carrot Snatch's Sherlock, or early Tony Stark, or House, or even Sheldon Cooper for that matter. This was a time where you'd unironically see the kind of posts that are mostly made fun of today, of people going, an argument between these six would be priceless, and just posting their favorite Ricks. I think, broadly speaking, this kind of fan favorite sort of represented a very specific conception of intelligence that was quite rife in many strains of the geek community at the time. A lot of people seemed to have the perception that intelligence was tied to a sort of snarky dismissiveness of the people around them. Again, this approach often did miss the point of the texts from which these characters originated, but nevertheless, you saw a lot of wannabe Tony Starks take that kind of aspirational message from characters like Rick. It's something I do understand because I was a bit like that too during this era, and while my experiences aren't universal, I think they're not uncommon either. If you were like a bullied teenager who was considered smart and considered misunderstood by peers who don't share your interests or treat you well and who don't understand or like you, I think there was a real sort of catharsis in seeing a character like BBC's Basketball Carrot Stick, one, openly deride everyone around them as being a bunch of judgmental idiots, and two, be treated by the narrative as correct. Like, yes, this guy is a super genius and people are wrong to misjudge him. Take that, girl from 4th period English class. I say this not to suggest, of course, that people were correct in their approach and in their veneration of the super genius asshole white guy archetype, but more so to contextualize why a character like that might have been appealing for a certain type of person to try and emulate. And to be clear, that isn't how reality operates. Being cruel doesn't make you clever, and being kind doesn't make you foolish, and being cruel and clever doesn't make you right. But the era of the Rick Sanchez reaction meme industrial complex nevertheless dominated certain more Reddit-adjacent strains of the internet for a good while. As a result, both My Little Pony and Rick and Morty fans quickly gained a similar reputation to outsiders that JoJo fans have now. You know those people who will not stop recommending their show to you and inserting it into every discussion and referencing their blorbos at every possible opportunity, but at the same time, like, there was never a better time to actually be part of those fandoms. Whether it was an explosion of fan works, getting to reference epic narwhal bacon moments with a like-minded community, or just the enjoyment of getting to experience a cool show in real time, this was a great era to be part of those cartoon fandoms. If we're gonna talk about big geek media properties though, it may be time to take out that pin we put in discussing Joss Whedon, because it's honestly impossible to provide any sort of analysis of the 2010s geek era without looking at the absolute chokehold Whedon had on geekdom for a good while. I've talked about Whedon and the politics of his work before, namely in my video on Dr. Horrible from way back when, which is incidentally where my Respect Women juice mug was first referenced, and if you want to buy that, link in the description. But it's worth acknowledging that for a good while, for massive chunks of the geek community, Joss Whedon was essentially seen as a god, as the king of all things geek. And to some extent, I do get why. This guy created Buffy, a show that's still one of my favorites despite my ever-mounting list of complaints about it. A lot of it either aged poorly or wasn't great to begin with, like Willow's dumb magic drugs subplot in the entire 7th season and everything in Seeing Red, and how the show framed Riley's clear insecure misogyny as being valid, or how bad the show is about race, whether it's about Jenny Calendar or the First Slayer or fucking any of that, or just Xander in general, just Xander. Anti-Xander action. Look, I wouldn't be so harsh on it if I didn't respect it so much. But people keep coming back to Buffy for a reason, and there really is a lot to love about it, from its often very honest portrayal of adolescence to the previously fairly uncommon style of teen speak to the masterful blending of the fantastical and the grounded in the human, and it was a cult classic for a reason.
Well, if this guy wants to fight with weapons, I've got it covered from A to Z, from axe to the other acts.
And then we have Firefly, a show which I liked for a while, and in retrospect honestly believe its premature cancellation to be the best thing that could have possibly happened to it, because I fully believe it would have gone on to be a very unremarkable show had it been allowed to continue. There's just no way as many people would have watched and enjoyed it without its cancellation and perceived wasted potential as a drawing point, I'm sorry. Anyway, people were already primed to like Whedon and have for a long time, but his subsequent direction of Dr. Horrible, video here, horror deconstruction, Cabin in the Woods, and then, you know, the fucking Avengers, especially cemented his status as geek writer god. On top of liking his work, some of this originates from the fact that, at the time, Whedon was often quite publicly lauded as a progressive feminist who respected women and wrote them as strong and multifaceted, and was able to build an audience and brand off of both his work and his accordingly feminist public image.
People are confronted by the word feminist and it stops them. They think they have to deal with that. But I think we're done with that as intelligent human beings. Being on the wrong side of history in terms of the oppression of women is being on the whole of history. If you're someone who genuinely believes that women don't deserve or aren't as much as men, you're like the plague, okay? In the big history chart, you're the plague. People feel removed from sexism. I'm not a sexist, but I'm not a feminist. They think there's this fuzzy middle ground. There's no fuzzy middle ground. You either believe that women are people or you don't. It's that simple.
That's not to say literally every geek in the world liked Whedon at the time, and there were, at bare minimum, whispers brewing about him not being great, but it would take many, many years for those notions to hit any kind of critical mass. For now, Joss was seen by many as a brilliant writer, an ardent feminist, and the cruel but beloved killer of many a fictional fave.
I'm a leaf on the wind. Watch how I go.
With the mass popularity and reverence with which Whedon was seen was also a rise in work very clearly inspired by some of his own artistic choices, more specifically in how Joss Whedon writes dialogue.
The language of Buffy is really the language of Joss Whedon.
I'm a blood-sucking fiend. Look at my outfit.
A lot of it is the way Joss naturally speaks.
It's more a verbal nonverbal.
That's absorbed by all of us and put into the speeches.
I'm gonna give you all a nice, fun, normal evening if I have to kill every single person on the face of the earth to do it.
Joss really talks that way, and we've all kind of adopted it.
I think Joss sort of wanted to try to do is accomplish the same kind of playing with language.
You're being careful, right?
Full of carefulness. And making it feel fresh and kind of young, while at the same time not making it feel dated.
Kiss rocks. Why would anyone want to kiss? Oh wait, I get it.
I touched on it a little bit earlier on, but one writing choice I think is particularly distinctive to Whedon is his heavy use of both quips and pop culture references, often intertwined. It's something that definitely makes sense for a show like Buffy, where the characters are snarky teenagers, but is a pretty consistent through line throughout most of his work. So you'll see a lot of characters remarking on their own situations in these kind of meta, blasé ways, for instance. Having Tony Stark go, "Please be secret door, please be secret door, please be secret door, yay!" Or having Buffy go, "Faith's not on the cover of Sanity Fair." At its best, the lines can be, well, funny. At worst, as writer Gita Jackson puts it, it sounds like a writer wrote it, which isn't always what you want when you're trying to inject sincerity into your work.
Wow, sarcasm. That's original.
Strong man as strong as alone. You ever heard that?
That's not a saying. That's the opposite of what the saying is.
You didn't see that coming.
Sorry, guys. I didn't bring a sword. Jesus. He is tall.
I'll make him die in ways he can't even imagine. That probably would have sounded more commanding if I wasn't wearing my yummy sushi pajamas.
Do you know what happens to a toad when it's struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else.
Whedon's popularity, particularly post-Avengers, inspired a wave of similarly quippy pieces of film and TV, especially as it pertains to superhero stuff. This is, of course, not to say Whedon necessarily invented, that just happened style quips. You'd see a lot of them in, for example, 2000s action films, but there was a noticeable increase where it felt like for a good while in the 2010s, it was a lot more rare to see a popular big name work that didn't include some kind of meta lampshading quip than the ones that did.
Yeah, that just happened.
Oh, they fly now! They fly now? They fly now!
Were you poisoned? No. Cursed? No. Kidnapped or enslaved? No. Are you guys okay? Should I call the police?
How do you know this?
That's what I do. I drink, and I know things.
Mantis, look out!
This was further exacerbated after the release of Deadpool, a film featuring a snarking, meta-quipping main character who works because he knows he's in a story.
Whose balls did I have to fondle to get my very own movie?
But not every character can be Deadpool. When overused, it can often start to feel like sarcastic lines are used to, 1, acknowledge but not actually seek to remedy storytelling flaws, and 2, undercut moments of sincerity or emotional honesty. Look, these lines can be funny and do have their place, but all I'm saying is the Lord of the Rings movies would not have been better if Frodo and Sam had encountered Shelob in the cave and gone, is anyone else seeing that giant spider over there? Looks like we got company. Really original. Let me guess, it spins giant webs and eats hobbits. Nevertheless, the years following the first Avengers release and following the release of Deadpool saw a significant rise in the use of lamp shading, meta jokes, and overall quips, and audiences broadly hadn't quite grown tired of it yet. See? Nerd shit isn't embarrassing or cringe. It can be funny too, they're self-aware about it. So by and large, this is how a lot of that online geekdom manifested. A near universal love for figures like Joss Whedon and Felicia Day, a newfound interest in cartoons and sarcastic super geniuses and geek rock artists like Jonathan Coulton, increased convention participation and new fans getting into gaming and anime, and the ways in which the consumer markets shifted to reflect this new boom in geekdom. Indeed, we got to the point where it was no longer easy and clear-cut to say that we have regular culture where people are into regular things and then geek culture where people are into geek things. After a while, this iteration of geek culture was just culture. At the same time, though, we were still growing into this world where what was once the domain of geeks and gamers was just an everyone thing. So we had more or less everyone being into Marvel and Rick and Morty and Game of Thrones and Critical Role, but at the same time, this notion of being an outsider, being a geek, was still deeply important to a lot of these fans. As a result, one thing we really started to see was the massive increase in geekdom as a consumer niche, where your nerdy credentials were expressed by how much geeky stuff you purchased and displayed. To some extent, this has always been a thing. I mean, if you go back to that geek quiz I linked earlier, one of the main questions is how much you like collecting stuff, comic books in particular. Marketing and branded merch isn't anything new, nor is it restricted to geek interests, not at all. No, any interest is going to have some form of branded product tying into it, whether it's something jockish like sports, the way moms will shank Walgreen employees for Squishmallows, or how the religion fandom is really into crucifix merch. But there has definitely been a notable shift in the 2010s in the way that geek products are designed, sold, and marketed, specifically in regard to things like Loot Crate and the rise of the fucking Funko Pop. For those who don't remember any YouTube advertisements back in 2012, Loot Crate is a subscription service built around themed boxes of nerd merch that would be delivered to your doorstep every month. Each month, the box would have its own theme that would somehow connect all the products together. As the company expanded, more options were offered, such as a more expensive tier that would give you more high-quality items, or things like Loot Anime, which would give you all anime-themed products. Loot Crate at its peak was huge, and the idea of loot-themed subscription boxes took off, with several other imitators rising up to offer their own take on the service. Loot Crate's popularity is especially notable because the crates themselves suck. Loot Crate is one of those things that sounds good on paper. For a minimum of $25 a month, you get a bunch of surprise nerd-branded merch, some of it being exclusive to Loot Crate, plus each box was guaranteed to come with a t-shirt with some kind of licensed image in it. And if you're someone who wears graphic tees a lot anyway, the box basically pays for itself based on that alone. But the problem is that the crates were often, bad, especially as they got more and more popular and the more people kept track of what all was coming in each box, because at the end of the day, a lot of the stuff you'd get in Loot Crates were somewhere in the range of sort of neat to cheap tat. It would be a lot of things like lanyards or fridge magnets, maybe single-issue comics, and that was often the best-case scenario. At worst, you'd get things like a fucking inflatable fucking crown, not a Lord of the Rings branded crown or anything, just a generic inflatable crown like you'd find at the dollar store for a kid's birthday party. There was also that time they put an Infinity Gauntlet oven mitt into one of the boxes that couldn't actually withstand high temperatures and ended up burning over 200 people to the point where they had to recall it, and if you sent the glove back, you got a t-shirt and a Simpsons keychain. That certainly was a thing that happened. I think that's sort of the encapsulation of the Loot Crate experience in a way. You have something that seems neat in theory, like an Infinity Gauntlet oven mitt, but it doesn't actually do anything for you. It doesn't look particularly good, it's not high quality, it's not well made, it doesn't even perform its basic function of oven mitt properly. It's cheap tat that is only interesting for people who just want to say that they own an oven mitt that looks like the Infinity Gauntlet instead of just, buying an actual high quality oven mitt for cheaper. The problem of the blind box method is that while there can be a fun novelty to it, if you're getting these monthly, you're going to be getting a lot of cheap stuff, and there's going to be a lot more of a chance that you end up with things you don't care for or don't find all that interesting. It was very common to see Loot Crate items go up for sale secondhand on sites like eBay or other marketplaces solely because there was often just so much pointless, useless, unappealing nothing included in them. And these didn't really sell well because people simply weren't interested, and these were products most people could already buy cheaper just by going to their local Target. Emily wrote this part, so it says whatever the Canadian equivalent of Target is, and now I'm just sad about Zellers. The Geek subscription box popularity definitely seems to have subsided. Loot Crate is technically still around. They filed for bankruptcy in 2019 and were bought out by another company, and you can still go to their website and buy way too many types of subscription boxes. But they definitely don't have the same cultural prominence they once had. You do still see geek merch boxes around, but weirdly enough, more in stores now than via delivery. It's a lot more common to walk into a place and find like a Zelda-themed merch box or an Animal Crossing gift set that theoretically operates the same as Loot Crate, except you buy it in a store and see what's included in the package beforehand. This seems like a better way to go, honestly, if anything, because it guarantees that you know what you're getting yourself into and you're only getting products that actually interest you. Loot Crate operated a lot on the concept of FOMO, the fear of missing out. They would tempt people into subscribing to their service because, well, it has exclusive merch and t-shirt designs, and if you don't get a USB drive in the shape of the Stark House sigil now, when will you ever be able to get it? You'll live the rest of your life saddened that you were deprived of your House Stark USB drive. FOMO is very big in a lot of geek merch marketing circles. This wasn't anything exclusive to the 2010s nerd scene. Just off the top of my head, comic book publishers have done things like numerous #1 printings and variant comic releases in order to put pressure on fans to buy comic issues immediately out of fear that they'll miss out on a rare and potentially valuable item. But it certainly became a lot more transparent in the 2010s. Take, for example, another online merch type that rose into prominence around this time, the geek graphic t-shirt website. I'm talking about websites like T-Fury or RIPT or any others like that, really. They offer limited edition graphic tees, their selection changing daily, with the idea being that once the stock of that shirt is gone, they're gone for good. The shirts often feature crossover designs between nerd properties, because at a certain time in the internet, the idea of pop culture imagery, but with another pop culture figure in its place, was considered the height of cool comedy. This would be stuff like, hey, what if you had the poster to Drive, but with Han Solo, or what if it was the Incredible Hulk, but instead of Hulk, it's the Incredible Meep, which are both T-Fury t-shirts that my co-writer Emily had in high school, and yes, she has been executed for her crimes. May she rest in peace on her own channel. These are lame. They're lame, I'm sorry. Most of these shirts are low effort, often have issues with stolen artwork or not properly crediting and compensating the artists, and just feel cheap. These sorts of sites got big through a lot of extensive advertising and the fact that at the time this was something people thought was really neat and funny. Oftentimes, these shirts don't really have a punchline, though, or any correlation that makes sense. Like, look at this one. It's just Scarlet Witch in the Pulp Fiction poster. What's the relation? Why mix these two together? Is there a punchline? Is there a greater meaning? There isn't. It's just acknowledging that two media properties exist and you happen to be a fan of both. That's what I keep coming back to with this stage of geek capitalism. Fan creativity and physical, tangible reminders of geekdom have always existed, often being cool or fun to collect. I mean, I own stuff like a TARDIS blanket because it's cool and soft and well-made and has a thing that I like on it. But increasing the perception that being a geek isn't so much something you do as something you buy is a massive wave of cheap, shitty, mass-produced tokens of geekdom, made unethically and designed to degrade and go out of style. Most of it isn't appealing or interesting or even anything worth collecting. They're often cheap, ugly products who sell themselves not on being interesting or compelling or reflecting qualities that make the original work notable, but rather are marketed based solely on brand recognition and limited availability. Which is how we get to the fucking Funko Pops. Funko Pops are plastic abominations, or I guess the kinder way to refer to them is that they are simple figurines notable for their big heads and round, soulless eyes that if you stare into long enough, you'll see your own damnation. You've probably seen them somewhere by now. They're pretty hard to avoid. Once they've infested a store, they grow and spread, and before you know it, they're taking up half the shelf space at your local bookstore or game shop. I hate Funko Pops. They're cheap and ugly, and there's so fucking many of them. Their level of terribleness is only matched by how brilliant they are from a business perspective. As Funko themselves have noted, the simplified and uniform nature of the main pop design allows for quick turnaround, where a new figure can be designed in 24 hours without a lot of troublesome R&D concerns. Furthermore, this uniformity presents a strong brand image, as you can tell when something is a Funko Pop, for worse or for worse. So if you're already collecting Funkos, there's an incentive to collect more to go with it. Now, look, I don't want people to hear everything that I've been saying and act like I'm saying that you can't buy merch or that you shouldn't buy things for whatever fandom you're part of. That would be hypocritical of me, for starters. I have a fucking TARDIS in my bedroom. But I'm also not here to be a stop having fun, guys person. You have my permission to get merch and shirts and figures and plushies and whatever you want that shows your interests and passions and blorbos. And if you get something out of them, more power to you. Absolutely. But I guess the thing I keep coming back to when I look at things like Funko Pops or Loot Crate or these crossover t-shirts is the ways that these things feel less like high-quality odes to the properties and mediums they're representing, and rather like cheap, low-effort, made-for assembly line production for mass consumption. The act of accruing a near-endless stream of merch items was oftentimes not really about demonstrating dedication to a particular fandom so much as it was seen as a tangible way to prove your geek cred. You buy them not because they look good or because they're high quality, but as a means of expressing your identity, an identity heavily steeped in corporate consumption. In a lot of ways, geekdom becomes an expression not just of what you love and what you create, but of what you buy, and the markets that grew to reflect that were huge. With this increase in cheap, mass-produced merchandise designed to cater to the geek identity, we saw a lot of indistinguishable brand items being pushed out on a wide scale and reinforcing a sort of nerd homogeneity. How neat is your box of nerd merchandise when it's shit you don't care about that a million other people are also getting and displaying on their shelf? Oh, that's a cool Triforce shirt. You should wear it, just like the million other guys buying a Triforce shirt and khaki shorts. Seriously, why did every geek boy wear this in the 2010s? Why was this ever a look? I don't know why. I don't even know if either of them ever wore this, but somehow it feels like Smosh's fault. This aspect of geek culture as primarily based around consumption rather than transformation or community isn't new, but the massive surge in geek as an identity being usable as a marketing term throughout the 2010s really exacerbated it. On top of the massive amounts of overconsumption of cheap, shitty merchandise with a geeky brand logo from a mega corporation hastily stamped onto it, you also saw a real rise in people treating the success of these brands like a form of team sport. For instance, you would see a lot of that when it came to the Marvel Cinematic Universe. People would use Avengers opening weekend numbers to flex on other franchises. There was this meme that got passed around basically challenging The Dark Knight Rises to get more money that summer, with people talking about how amazing it was that Marvel made more money off a film full of B-list heroes while others were struggling with their A-listers. A lot of people would gloat about how Avengers got better reviews than Green Lantern or Amazing Spider-Man. There was this whole push to see it not just as fun popcorn entertainment movies, but a big monumental achievement, both from a financial standpoint and an artistic one. There were people celebrating Avengers Endgame becoming the highest grossing film of all time and then feeling legit upset when Avatar usurped it again later during the pandemic, as if it really sucks that Endgame only made $2.9 billion and not $2.95 billion. There were these discussions about how it was unfair and how it didn't count because Avatar needed to re-release to achieve that top spot, unlike Endgame that, well, also did a re-release to push itself into the top spot, but like that was different. So you have the consumption of nerd shit as team sports, a genuine celebration at the act of having made a few more dollars for multi-billion-dollar corporation Disney. Or you have people demanding Marvel movies be nominated for Best Picture, demanding that these films attain some higher degree of critical respect. Or you have people bothering prestige directors like Martin Scorsese and demanding to know their perspectives on Marvel stuff, reacting with anger and defensiveness when they don't respond with veneration. It got to the point where Scorsese had to write an op-ed for the New York Times clarifying his position, saying that he doesn't get anything out of them, that he's from a different generation, so he doesn't quite understand the current appeal, and perhaps more importantly, that the Marvel enterprise scares him because it's dominating the film landscape in a way where more artistic pictures can struggle to get funding, theater screens, or public support. And yeah, that's a legitimate concern, both in general and also for Scorsese himself, an auteur who has made numerous films and constantly dealt with issues with funding and distribution of his work despite heavy amounts of acclaim and popularity. And yeah, Scorsese is an almost 80-year-old man. Of course he's not going to be super invested in the MCU. And that's not to say a discussion over what we ought to consider art or cinema is inherently worthless. I think calling a film not cinema is strange, and it's not something I would do. But at the same time, why should we care? Why do we need to continually ask acclaimed directors how they feel about popcorn corporate superhero product number 84? Why do we need their respect in order to validate the merit of these already massively commercially and critically successful films? Do you need to go dig up the corpse of François Truffaut and ask him what he thought of Spider-Man No Way Home? Why celebrate these multi-billion-dollar corporations making more billions? Why do these things need to be considered high art to make fans happy? The answer, of course, lies in that disconnect between the historical roots of the geek community and its present condition. It feels like a relic from a time when geek genuinely was this kind of bullied, downtrodden counterculture. If you belong to an identity group that has to deal with constantly being mocked for your interests, it's going to feel great to see the thing you love succeed.
They say that geeks become chic. To all the asshat jocks who beat me up in school, now I'm the one that's cool. I'm the one that's cool.
And so in a lot of ways, I think this attitude reflects this now dated conception of the geek as an oppressed underdog. You still have the underlying belief that to be a nerd is to be persecuted, but at the same time, the actual real-world conditions around you reflect the exact opposite of that. So you not only get this fervent demand for geek stuff to be liked and consumed by everyone, but also this notion that a rejection of geek culture is somehow the dominant attitude, the bully picking on the loser. This underlying attitude of constant persecution mixed with this kind of entitled demand for widespread adulation, however, is certainly not limited to Marvel fans. People being kind of annoying about box office numbers and bothering directors about whether or not they think Iron Man is high art or corporate slop is certainly obnoxious, but it's not the worst manifestation of that attitude. Because all in all, this attitude of viewing geek identity as fundamentally oppressed and thus entitled to a very specific kind of respect can manifest itself in much more harmful ways than that. This is especially notable, for example, with regards to how many facets of geek culture have historically treated women. For a long time, being incapable of getting a girl was considered one of, if not the biggest stereotypes about the male geek.
Come on, you know I can't talk to women unless I'm lit up like the Hindu festival of Diwali.
You know, prom's like in 4 days.
Oh my god. You're not asking me to prom, are you?
Very funny. You guys are being real mature.
Maybe we were adopted.
It's D&D. Virgins.
It's a constant punchline on Big Bang Theory, despite the fact that the men on that show are often incredibly blatantly sexist and hostile to women. Their initial inability to find dates is portrayed primarily as a function of their nerdiness and social awkwardness. It's a running joke in the 1984 comedy Revenge of the Nerds. It's still a punchline even in recent comedy. Look at incredible TV comedy masterpiece What We Do in the Shadows, where the vampires want to drink virgin blood, so their insane little guy goes and finds some at a LARPing event.
I've managed to find a group with an extremely high ratio of virgins.
So, LARPing, as you probably know, stands for live action role playing.
Which is very funny if you know any LARPing people. Those guys are all like obnoxiously kinky. The point is that women being put off by men's geekiness is a long-standing stereotype, one that may to some effect be based in reality, but only serves to reinforce this notion that geekdom is a naturally male domain. It can also manifest itself in a sort of entitlement to women and entitlement to the respect and admiration of women. Go look up what happens in Revenge of the Nerds if you want to be very uncomfortable. But more on that in a sec. In actuality, a lot of geek stuff has been shaped by women first and foremost. The first Star Trek fans were by and large middle-aged housewives, for instance. And so when women are kept out of geek communities, it isn't by some natural biological lack of desire for women to be into geek shit, it's because they're made to feel unsafe or unwanted in those communities, whether by way of sexual harassment, gatekeeping, or just overall hostility. It's noteworthy that not only was the fake geek girl meme an incredibly popular image macro in the early 2010s, but also more or less any woman who has been inside a comic shop has had that experience. I don't even need to say what the experience is, we all know. There was often this notion that women were desired, loved, and accepted in geek communities, but in a lot of cases what was actually meant by that was that women's bodies were desired, loved, and accepted. Once again, this was really an era of geek is the new sexy, where you'd see these hot woman cosplay pinups and image macros of hot girls in glasses being spread around as the female ideal in geek communities. So the image of an attractive geek girl was very popular, but not so much their actual personhood. We're fine with women being in our movies and games, you'll hear, and then they'll throw out examples of like Lara Croft and Sarah Connor, while at the same time demonizing a lot of feminist narratives or female characters existing without a visibly sexual lean to them. Women's bodies were broadly accepted in a lot of communities as long as they fit certain parameters, thin and attractive and light-skinned, for instance, but for women themselves, it was a lot more of a toss-up. I mean, they even turned on Felicia Day for making the most milquetoast condemnation of gender-based harassment. A lot of times, women in these communities would have to either aggressively sexualize themselves for conditional acceptance, but still be faced with intense gatekeeping and harassment as a result, or intentionally desexualize themselves and work incredibly hard to assure everyone that they are not like those other fake geek girls, and either way, it's not a great position to be in. For a lot of people, this unified geek culture never really worked for them in the same way it worked for you if you were a mildly socially awkward white dude. And of course, this is broadly true for a lot of people of color as well, who have also talked at length about the racism present in a lot of these geek communities. Princess Weeks has a great video up on racism in fandom if you want to hear more about that, which I'll link in the description. Once again, this is really the ultimate expression of this underdogification entitlement cocktail. There was, for instance, this perception that the introduction of gender, sexual, and racial diversity into geek communities was somehow a threat to them, that geek communities were, dare I say, a safe space for a specific type of socially awkward bully dude, and that therefore any attempts to change up or broaden the scope of who was welcome there was akin to the popular kid trying to take the loser's favorite lunchbox away. This was an attitude that's always been present in many geek subcultures to some extent, and whether or not we want to acknowledge it, it was unfortunately a huge part of 2010's geekdom. And when we're looking at factors that led to the decline of this era, we unfortunately do have to acknowledge that a big reckoning in terms of what this culture looked like was the direct result of things like Gamergate. For those who don't remember, Gamergate was a harassment campaign masquerading as an ethical gamer movement. Chat rooms and groups full of geeks and gamers banded together to attack journalists and women and anyone they deemed a potential enemy for the purpose of deplatforming them or causing them actual serious psychological harm. This was seen both as a way to personally get back at certain online figures they had vendettas against, but also as an overall push against the increase of diversity in geek spheres under the guise of caring about ethics in video game journalism. And to help fix ethics in video game journalism, people were hacked, doxxed, and sent credible death threats. This was a shitty time to be online, and many people felt unsafe simply talking about games. If you want to see a really detailed play-by-play breakdown of exactly what Gamergate was and how exactly it happened, I'd recommend Innuendo Studios' lecture on it, complete with lots of different primary sources and a really accessible breakdown. It should hopefully disabuse anyone watching of the notion that this was ever anything other than an attempt to leverage the power of some socially awkward guys on the internet in service of ruining someone's life. A lot of this stuff manifested itself in the notion that the internet had become infested with powerful social justice warriors who were ruining their sacred underdog space, and an entire genre of online content was created on this sole basis. Rant YouTubers and pop culture reactionaries existed before Gamergate, to be sure, but it was really this period that popularized it. This was where you really saw people able to make a decent career for themselves just by uploading a video with some title like SJW triggered by Batman the Killing Joke and ranting about some random person online who might have said they didn't like a thing. That's what happens when you don't like the Killing Joke. There's a direct through line between these types of anti-SJW rant tubers and the conservative commentators that have gotten popular on these platforms today. This whole Gamergate and anti-SJW backlash really seemed to reach a peak and transformation in 2016. Gee, wonder what else was happening in 2016. Really makes you think. In July of that year, a reboot of Ghostbusters came out, and said reboot had the audacity to feature an all-woman main cast. A lot of people lost their shit about this for some reason. To some extent, some of this could be attributed to the normal reservations people have about reboots, especially in the case where it's a reboot of a fairly beloved 80s film a lot of people have fond memories of. If someone was skeptical of a reboot solely because they were a fan of the original and just decided to say, no review, I refuse, then sure, power to them, I guess. But the fact of the matter is that what happened with Ghostbusters 2016 wasn't that. Instead, it was a massive backlash against a film for no other reason than having female leads, and suddenly this mildly mediocre comedy film became the battleground for this intense culture war and the fight against diversity. Actress Leslie Jones, in particular, got treated terribly by the internet, being met with a lot of harassment and racism and misogyny because of the film, to the point where she was doxxed and had her account hacked and nudes leaked, all because she had the audacity to be a black woman in a Ghostbusters reboot. Once again, beyond all the obvious racism and sexism that pervaded this culture, the initial perception of nerds as underdogs was a really dominant motivating factor. The disconnect between the cultural perception of the nerd and the actual tangible cultural power and dominance of the nerd was palpable. Gamergate on the whole constituted a real shift in what this nerd culture looked like, bringing already existing community issues with racism and misogyny to a fever pitch. You started to see a lot more sci-fi properties used as nexuses for various culture wars, especially after the release of the second Star Wars sequel, The Last Jedi, and there was overall a lot less perception of the geek as one specific universal aesthetic. Instead, it was all these factions who fucking hated each other. To some extent, that's always been a thing. There's nothing more nerd than fighting over nerd properties, but there was a notable shift in the atmosphere post-Gamergate, and it really made the era of meme-based and ThinkGeek stuff feel a bit of the past. Gamergate and the ensuing mass of anti-diversity complain tubers who lose their shit whenever a gay person exists in a cartoon, while a massive stain on these communities, however, wasn't the only factor leading to the overall decline of this geek as an identity institution. The ensuing years were marked by a number of events that cast previously popular fixtures of geek communities in a negative light. For example, Rick and Morty, which had already received a bit of flack from non-fans for being marked with a somewhat cringy fan attitude, reached its cringe nexus in 2017.
It's chaos at a McDonald's over, of all things, Szechuan sauce. Customers crowd the counter demanding the Szechuan dipping sauce for their McNuggets. Outside, hundreds more are lining up. What on earth is going on here?
After McDonald's announced they were bringing back their Szechuan sauce for a day after the sauce became a meme on Rick and Morty and wildly underestimated the number of sauces they'd need to distribute, fans got very embarrassing about it. Very, very embarrassing about it. I'm talking people making protest signs, threatening to sue the chain for false advertising, and even people who were lucky enough to get their hands on a packet of Szechuan sauce successfully selling them for at least $15,000. Fans were brutally mocked for the Szechuan meltdown, and while Rick and Morty went on to release 2 more well-received seasons, the reputation of Richard and Mortimer fans and the sort of stereotype of faux intellectual nerdery with which they were associated never really recovered. Pretty much everyone I know who was into Rick and Morty after that would always have to preface them liking Rick and Morty with like, yeah, but I'm not one of those fans though. I think you can see a real cultural shift in how people started to see the whole look at all these nerdy brands style geek pandering in some of the reception to the film Ready Player One.
It's fucking Chucky!
I can't prove this, but I'm at least going to put forth my theory that if that film released in like 2013, it would have been a lot more well-liked than it is now. I mean, it may be hard to remember now, but back when that book came out, it was incredibly popular, becoming well-reviewed by critics and accepted by nerd circles. Even my co-writer Emily was once told by a professor when the book came out that she seemed like someone who would enjoy Ready Player One, and according to Emily, it's the meanest thing anyone has ever said to her, and that means something because she's a trans woman on the internet. But at the time, there was this fascination with works that just acknowledged that geeky, non-mainstream material can exist, and Ready Player One was the epitome of that mindset.
Mechagodzilla!
The book isn't really transformative in how it utilizes these nerd properties and references, not in the same way something like Scott Pilgrim is. Rather, it uses them as flavor, decorations that you're supposed to look at and go, wow, I know what that is. Characters are rewarded not for their ability to be creative or transformative and problem solve, but rather just to remember things from popular media projects and recreate them to a T. In that way, it's kind of the ultimate expression of a nerd culture that's more about passive consumption of brands than about an active process of community building and interpretation. It's not about deriving interesting themes or personal meaning from your favorite movie, but about being able to recreate it exactly. And at a certain time, it might have been cool to read a book where they ride around on the DeLorean and reference the temples of Syrinx from 2112, but now it all feels really, really cringe. And you can see this not just in the way that the Ready Player One film was ridiculed by many when it came out, but in the way the sequel book, Ready Player Two, was basically ignored by the general public and reviewed significantly worse by mainstream critics. That sort of geek pandering is rightfully thought to be lame and shallow nowadays. Joss Whedon, who had previously attained a sort of hero worship status among nerds for years, also experienced a rather embarrassing fall from grace after multiple allegations of creating an abusive work environment came to light. To some extent, this was known for years. Anyone who followed Angel for any time could tell you for years why Charisma Carpenter won't work with him anymore, but these accusations really went mainstream in recent years, especially following his wildly controversial direction of Justice League. In a lot of ways, this prompted a critical reappraisal of some of his works, and you'll see a lot more online backlash to both his self-proclaimed feminist nature and the overly quippy tones his writing can take. There was this entire meme going around last year, which was just to edit screen caps from your favorite movie as if Joss Whedon wrote them. They're very, very good. You started to see a simultaneous mainstreaming of formerly geeky interests and a decline of the actual geek aesthetic, at least the way it manifested itself over that specific period of time. Some of this was already happening throughout the late 2010s with stuff like the aforementioned Gamergate and the Szechuan sauce fiasco and whatnot, but if I had to date the end of a lot of these 2010s cultural institutions to a specific year, I'd probably trace a lot of it back to 2019. 2019 saw both the shuttering of previous geek culture institutions ThinkGeek and Geek and Sundry, and also the release of the wildly commercially successful Avengers Endgame. 2019 is when Loot Crate filed for bankruptcy. 2019 was when Game of Thrones ended, and it was so critically detested that it essentially destroyed the decade worth of cultural capital that it had built up. It just does not get talked about anymore, not outside people deriding how horribly it ended. 2019 finally marked the end of The Big Bang Theory, a show that had gone on to earn more than 220 television award nominations and more than 50 wins. 2019 also saw the release of the Joker movie, which was considered the most profitable comic book movie of all time and became a massive cultural sensation. The final film of the Star Wars sequel trilogy dropped and made massive amounts of money and generated tons of cultural waves, and then it was just over. So in many ways, this year represented this paradoxical growth and decline of geek culture. Geekdom, in the sense of a specific 2010s cultural aesthetic, was on the decline, while many of the actual interests previously relegated to the domain of niche geek counterculture were on the rise. It's weird to say more geek stuff led to fewer geeks, but I guess if I had to explain it, there was so much geek stuff that it just became stuff. Normal stuff liked by normal people. Nearly everything that defined geekdom had become incorporated into the dominant culture. When everyone's geeky, no one is. All in all, this era of early 10s geekdom is definitely a mixed bag. In some ways, looking back on this mass popularization of all things geeky, I can see the joy and passion and fun that brought people into this culture. I think it's great that we live in a world where we see less ostracization and bullying for people who love computers and tabletop role-playing games and comic books. And when these fan communities get together, you can see some honestly amazing shit and make some great memories. I'll never forget the hours I spent jamming with my friends to Jonathan Colton songs and making my shitty cosplays of Darth Xana from the Star Wars Bane series because I had never done anything like it before, or the girl at Comic Expo who helped me with my Junko Enoshima costume when it was starting to come apart. The absolute joy of stepping into that con hall for the first time and seeing people, real people who loved all the same stuff I did when I never had that before, is unforgettable. All communities to some degree are created out of some kind of love and passion, but I think geek communities especially are ones that, at their best, are filled with unique levels of love and dedication and creativity. At the same time though, looking back on this era of geek culture, there's a lot there which, all these years later, kinda sucked. Even beyond the ways in which that culture could be incredibly hostile to women and people of color and queer people, the ways in which geekdom started to serve as a vessel for unbridled consumerism are incredibly tangible. Beyond the wave of near-identical, cheap, mass-produced slogan t-shirts and Funko Pops, what we really saw in this culture was a worship of brands and stuff before any kind of transformation or community building. It was less about seeing geek media as art to be engaged with or to have meaning derived from, and more like Pokemon cards to collect, to recall quotes and trivia from the drop of a hat, to tick boxes off lists, to laud over others your superior degree of engagement with the source material. We started to see a culture that was less about the love and celebration of lesser appreciated art forms and one that was more about conspicuous consumption in team sports. And to some extent, it's inevitable that a culture like that wasn't going to last forever. Don't get me wrong, we still have self-proclaimed geeks and gamers and countercultures, and we always will. But the iteration of 2010's geekdom, the Joss Whedon of it all, feels markedly dated now. When the Funko Pops and Triforce t-shirts and self-aware quips wear off, it starts to become clear that a lot of the objects of geek affection themselves weren't always very good. And when that happens, all we have left are the fan cultures themselves and the communities we build. Strong fan cultures built around transformation and creation are likely going to have some staying power. Fan cultures based around consumption and box office numbers and preserving a defunct sense of nicheness and persecution are only going to crumble with time. That just happened. If you enjoyed me talking about a bunch of really nerdy stuff, the good news is that absolutely nothing is nerdier than competitive debate. On top of internet culture from the 2010s and sociology, another thing I have a big background in is competitive debate. I used to be a debater as well as a debate coach, and I have this exclusive video called Debater Theater, where essentially I talk through how to better use arguments to persuade others and how to better identify when persuasive rhetoric is hiding in plain sight all around us. So that's things like in film, TV, and award acceptance speeches. If you want to watch that video, you can check it out on Nebula. Basically, Nebula is a collaborative streaming platform full of educational and entertaining content by people like me, Big Joel, Princess Weeks, Philosophy Tube, Wendover, and way more. Nebula is especially a really great place for content that might not be best suited for YouTube as a result of things like copyright and monetization. So, for example, my my most recent video on Idiocracy has more content available in the Nebula version. Stuff like exemplifying clips from the film that I couldn't play on YouTube. Same with my Dear Evan Hansen video. When you sign up for Nebula, you also get early access to my videos and can watch them without the ads or sponsor segments when you watch them on Nebula. Nebula has also partnered with CuriosityStream, a streaming service with thousands of exciting documentaries that address our desire to learn and focus on things like science, history, and technology. For example, if you're interested in geek culture, CuriosityStream has a documentary up called Triumph of the Nerds, essentially detailing how stuff like computer science became mainstream. Signing up for CuriosityStream also gets you full access to Nebula, all for less than $15 a year. If you're interested in Debater Theater, watching mine and tons of other creators' videos early and ad-free, watching any other exclusive content by your favorite creators, or getting access to thousands of educational documentaries, just head to curiositystream.com/SarahZ and use my code SarahZ at signup. That's curiositystream.com/SarahZ. Hey everyone! On top of a big thank you to all my patrons, I wanted to say a special thank you to my $20 plus patrons. I also wanted to let you guys know that starting this month, you're going to start seeing more patron exclusive content, such as these unscripted shorter form videos that patrons can watch and vote on. So if that's something that interests you, check it out. For now, I want to say a big thank you to Stansky, Sarah Jaffrey, Benson Lai, Kitsune, Clayton and Claire Page, Roman Antonacci, Evan Grip, Zach Radley, Simon Welsh, Robert Valentine Allen, Robert Gelhar, Lachlan Newport, Elizabeth Bushman, Yehuda Katz, Vostok, and Jacob Furtado. Thank you so much.